Elric Blauvelt was a decorated soldier. Cati Blauvelt was his devoted wife. Yvenne Kress was the hidden tenant who watched them from the shadows. What seemed like a perfect marriage was quietly unraveling behind closed doors, until Cati vanished without a trace. What followed was a chilling descent into obsession, betrayal, and a murder so calculated it stunned an entire town. This is the haunting story of Cati Blauvelt, death of a soldier's wife. Cati Blauvelt lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside the military base in Halstead, Georgia. With white fences, blooming dogwoods, and neighbors who waved, politely but kept to themselves, it was the kind of place where tragedy felt distant, almost impossible. Cati, in particular, was known as someone who brought light into every space she entered. She had an easy smile, a kind voice, and a way of remembering the smallest details about the people she met. Her husband, Staff Sergeant Elric Blauvelt, was often away on deployment, but when he returned, the couple was seen attending community events hand in hand, looking every bit the picture of a happy, stable marriage. Cati ran the local animal rescue program, where she helped rehome stray dogs and feral cats. She kept a small vegetable garden, posted photos of her baked goods online, and never missed a Sunday service at the chapel. But beneath the calm surface of Cati's life, there were fractures too subtle for most to notice. Since returning from Trehof, his third deployment, Elric had changed. He was quieter, more withdrawn, and often irritable. At first, everyone assumed it was just the weight of combat lingering. Cati never spoke publicly about any issues, but close friends mentioned she had grown more reserved over time. She stopped attending group outings. Her posts became less frequent and more filtered. What once looked like a life filled with warmth now seemed carefully managed, almost staged. On the morning of October 17th, the weather in Halstead was unusually cold for the season. The sun had barely risen when a co-worker from the animal shelter called Cati's phone. She hadn't shown up for work and hadn't notified anyone. Several hours passed. Another volunteer drove by her home and noticed her car in the driveway. The lights were off. The mailbox was full. By evening, Cati's absence was beginning to feel alarming. The missing persons report was filed at 7:42 p.m. by her younger sister Renea, who lived 2 towns over. She hadn't been able to reach Cati all day, and when she spoke to Elric, he claimed not to have seen her in 3 days. He said she'd left in the middle of the night after an argument, and that he thought she was staying with a friend. But when asked which friend, he couldn't name one. That same night, officers arrived at the Blauvelt residence for a wellness check. Elric answered the door looking exhausted and somewhat irritated. He allowed them inside. The home was tidy, but oddly so, like it had been recently cleaned with great care. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered windows, nothing to suggest violence. But Cati's purse, phone charger, and house slippers were still inside. Her beloved dog, Sander, was locked in the laundry room, something she never did. Friends began to speak up. One mentioned that Cati had been unusually anxious in recent weeks. Another recalled a strange conversation where Cati had wondered aloud what would happen if someone just vanished. These hints, which had once seemed harmless, now rang with a chilling weight. By the following morning, search efforts began. Volunteers walked wooded trails. Drones scanned the nearby riverbanks. Still, there was no sign of Cati. News of her disappearance spread quickly across social media, with people sharing photos, last known sightings, and heartfelt pleas for her return. The community rallied behind her, tying yellow ribbons to mailboxes and organising prayer circles. Elric, however, remained oddly silent. He declined interviews. He stopped attending the search parties. When questioned again, he repeated his story, but added new details that contradicted what he had first told officers. According to him, Cati had become unpredictable, and he had grown tired of the emotional strain. He didn't say much more. What had seemed like the disappearance of a loving wife was beginning to look like something far more disturbing. Behind Cati's warm smile and picture-perfect life, there were secrets waiting to be uncovered, secrets that would eventually point investigators toward a truth more shocking than anyone in Halstead could have imagined. 3 days had passed since Cati Blauvelt vanished without a trace. The town of Halstead buzzed with speculation, and volunteers continued to search the wooded areas, creek beds, and abandoned barns on the outskirts. Despite the effort, there were no promising leads. Cati's social media accounts remained inactive, her credit cards untouched, and her phone silent. For someone who had lived such a visible, community-centered life, her sudden disappearance was both confusing and deeply unsettling. On the 4th day, investigators returned to the Blauvelt residence with a warrant in hand. While the first visit had raised concerns, there was now enough suspicion to justify a more thorough search. Officers moved room by room, carefully documenting everything. The house was neat, with surfaces recently wiped and floors spotless. That in itself was a red flag. According to her sister, Cati had been feeling overwhelmed lately and hadn't been keeping up with cleaning. Something felt off. Then they reached the basement. At first glance, it was ordinary. A cluttered space with storage boxes, old gym, equipment, and holiday decorations. But as they swept their flashlights across the concrete floor, they noticed something odd near the back wall. A floor lamp lay broken, its bulb shattered nearby. Next to it was a dark stain, small but suspicious. A technician swabbed it immediately for testing. Behind a set of cardboard boxes stacked waist-high, investigators found what appeared to be drag marks, faint streaks in the dust leading toward a seldom-used back door. The door was locked from the inside, no signs of forced entry. That meant whoever moved through it had keys and familiarity with the house. Investigators began to build a timeline. According to Elric, he had left early the morning after their alleged argument and gone on a hunting trip in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He claimed to have no signal during the 2 days he was gone, but cell tower data painted a different story. His phone had remained near Halstead for most of that time. Even more disturbing was what they found next. Inside the basement, tucked inside a storage bin beneath old blankets, officers discovered a clump of long blonde hair, entangled in duct tape. The discovery shifted the tone of the investigation instantly, from missing person to likely homicide. Lab results would later confirm that the blood stain on the floor matched Cati's DNA. The pressure on Elric intensified. He was brought in for questioning again, and while he maintained his hunting alibi, his responses grew vaguer and less consistent. He insisted he had no idea what had happened to Cati, and suggested that perhaps she had run off with someone. But officers were no longer buying it. He couldn't explain the hair, the blood, or the phone records. To make matters worse, a local teenager walking her dog discovered Cati's cell phone in a storm drain 10 miles from her home. The phone was damaged by water, but recoverable. After being dried and powered on, investigators retrieved partial data. The last message sent from her phone was a voice memo recorded at 10:13 p.m. the night she vanished. While garbled, a forensic audio expert detected heavy breathing and what sounded like muffled movement, followed by a sudden thud. The message ended there. With mounting evidence, the case gained urgency. Officers canvassed nearby businesses and obtained surveillance footage from gas stations and traffic cameras. One image captured a dark SUV, matching the description of Elric's vehicle, heading toward a wooded area at 2:17 a.m. the night of her disappearance. Another camera showed the same vehicle returning 2 hours later. The calm surface of the Blauvelt home was now fully disrupted. Elric, once respected as a loyal soldier, was now the primary suspect in his wife's suspected murder. Behind the closed doors of that seemingly peaceful basement, something violent had occurred. Cati had not simply vanished. She had been taken, and the clues she left behind were finally starting to form a story that investigators could follow, one that would only grow darker as they uncovered more. As investigators continued to dissect the events surrounding Cati Blauvelt's disappearance, the focus shifted from the basement to the people who had recently entered her life. While all signs initially pointed to her husband Elric, something still felt incomplete. Detectives began looking into the couple's property records and discovered something unexpected. There was a guest house on the far edge of the backyard. It had its own entrance, barely visible from the main road, and had not been mentioned by Elric during the interviews. When questioned about it later, he casually admitted that a tenant lived there, someone he said kept it to herself and wasn't involved in anything. That tenant was Yvenne Kress, a 26-year-old woman with no family in the area and a minimal digital footprint. She had moved in roughly 6 months earlier, paying rent in cash. Neighbours had rarely seen her. The local mail carrier said the mailbox connected to the guest house had barely been used. No one in the neighbourhood had ever interacted with her. It was as though she lived in the shadows of the Blauvelt home, a silent figure in a hidden space. Investigators visited the guest house the same afternoon they found the hair and blood in the main house. The inside of Yvenne's unit was a stark contrast to the rest of the property. The blinds were always drawn and the furniture mismatched. But what immediately caught attention were the notebooks stacked on the kitchen table. Page after page, each filled with handwritten letters addressed to Elric. They weren't mailed, nor were they ever meant to be. The tone varied. Some were romantic, others angry, and several were deeply unsettling. Phrases like, "She doesn't deserve you," and "Our life is waiting once she's gone," were scribbled repeatedly. In the bedroom closet, officers discovered a box containing a photograph of Cati with her face slashed out. Underneath it was a pair of gloves, rope, and an empty container of sleeping pills. Yvenne was brought in for questioning immediately. Her behaviour was calm but distant. She admitted to having a relationship with Elric, one she described as spiritual and unbreakable. According to her, Cati had always stood in the way of their connection. She claimed that Elric had made promises, plans for the future, marriage, children. She believed he would leave his wife eventually. But when told about Cati's disappearance, Yvenne showed no visible concern. She claimed she hadn't seen Cati in days and had assumed she was visiting family. Her story was that she and Elric had been in love, but hadn't spoken in over a week. That statement didn't hold for long. Phone records revealed dozens of late-night calls between them in the days leading up to Cati's disappearance. On October 16th, just hours before Cati vanished, Yvenne and Elric had spoken for over 2 hours. Detectives pressed her for answers, but Yvenne maintained that she knew nothing about what had happened. Still, the evidence was building. Her writings, the altered photo, the surveillance footage showing her purchasing rope and gloves 2 weeks earlier. It all pointed to something far more sinister than a casual affair. And then a forensic sweep of her trash uncovered something chilling. A burned letter, partially intact, with the words, "I did it for us," still visible on the charred paper. This letter changed everything. Whether she had committed the crime, or simply fantasized about it, it was clear that Yvenne had been deeply, obsessed, perhaps unstable. The case was no longer just about a missing woman or a lying husband. It was about a triangle of secrets. Hidden lives lived under one roof. Elric had told no one about Yvenne. Cati had never mentioned her to friends. Yvenne, on the other hand, had built an entire fantasy around a life with Elric, one in which Cati did not exist. Despite all of this, there was still no physical evidence linking Yvenne directly to Cati's disappearance. She had motive and obsession, but nothing that placed her at the scene of the crime. Suspicion grew, but charges could not be filed. She was released under surveillance, and attention turned once more to Elric, whose lies were beginning to unravel. The presence of Yvenne Kress added a dangerous new dimension to the case, one that investigators believed could soon lead them to the truth buried beneath this haunting mystery. With Yvenne Kress now in the picture, the investigation into Cati Blauvelt's disappearance became more complex. Detectives were no longer focused on a single suspect. They were now unraveling a conspiracy. As they pieced together timelines, phone records, and behavioral patterns, it became clear that Elric and Yvenne's connection ran deeper than either of them had initially admitted. The affair, once portrayed as one-sided, was actually long-term and well hidden. There were secret meetups at motels 2 towns away, late-night texts using coded language, and shared purchases that now looked suspicious. Plastic, tarps, bleach, a shovel. Elric's military background also came under scrutiny. As a staff sergeant, he had training in logistics, planning, and evidence concealment. He knew how to move without leaving traces. His colleagues described him as disciplined and methodical, which made his slip-ups all the more curious. Investigators believed he had grown overconfident, assuming that his image as a soldier would protect him. But his inconsistencies kept stacking up. When asked why his SUV appeared on traffic cameras near the river at 2:17 a.m., he claimed he couldn't remember. When questioned about the missing tarp seen in his garage in a photo from a month earlier, he said it had been stolen. Nothing he said aligned with the facts. Then came a breakthrough. A retired volunteer named Marul Tavin, who often helped at the local animal shelter, contacted police after remembering something odd. Murrell had visited the Blauvelt home the week before Cati vanished to help repair a fence. While walking to the shed behind the house, he had seen Elric and Yvenne arguing near the woods. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, just assumed it was a personal moment. But now it felt like a critical piece of the puzzle. Investigators searched the wooded area behind the Blauvelt home again, this time with cadaver dogs. On the second day of the search, the dogs picked up a scent in a dense thicket near the edge of the property line, where brush and fallen branches had been intentionally stacked. Beneath that mound, partially buried, officers discovered a large black duffel bag. Inside were Cati's clothes, still stained with blood, and a broken necklace her sister confirmed she wore daily. Nearby, buried deeper in the soil, they uncovered a small metallic object, Cati's wedding ring. This discovery shifted the case from missing person to homicide. Officially, DNA testing confirmed the blood belonged to Cati. The proximity of the burial site to the home left no doubt that it had been hastily covered and deliberately hidden. The evidence was overwhelming, and police moved quickly to arrest Elric Blauvelt. Whittier town reacted with disbelief. A man once praised for serving his country was now in handcuffs, accused of killing his wife and burying her body just steps from where they once held backyard barbecues. Elric remained expressionless during his arrest, but what disturbed investigators most was his lack of remorse. During the interrogation that followed, he didn't ask once about Cati. Instead, he asked if his military pension would still be available. But while Elric was charged with murder, the case wasn't closed. Yvenne Kress remained a shadowy figure. Though the burned letter and threatening writings pointed to involvement, there was still no direct evidence placing her at the crime scene. However, digital forensics offered a final twist. A deleted photo was recovered from her phone, a blurry image of the wooded area behind the Blauvelt home, time-stamped just after midnight on the night Cati disappeared. That photo, combined with the items found in her possession, was enough to bring her back in for questioning. Faced with mounting pressure, Yvenne cracked. She admitted she had helped Elric move Cati's body after he killed her during a heated argument. According to her, she hadn't witnessed the act, but was told by Elric that it was finally done. She claimed she had only helped because she was scared and believed they would start a new life together. That confession was enough to charge Yvenne with accessory to murder and evidence tampering. The plan they thought would bring them freedom had instead trapped them in a web of their own making. As the courtroom prepared for what would become one of the most talked-about trials in Georgia's recent history, the final chapter of Cati Blauvelt's tragic story was about to unfold. The trial of Elric Blauvelt and Yvenne Kress began under a heavy cloud of public scrutiny. The once quiet town of Halstead had become the centre of media attention, with camera crews stationed outside the courthouse and true crime reporters flooding in from across the country. Everyone wanted to hear how a decorated soldier and his secret lover could become the architects of such a cold, calculated tragedy. The prosecution called it a murder fueled by lust and entitlement, while the defense tried to paint it as a moment of rage, followed by panic. But no one could deny the cruelty involved in how Cati Blauvelt's life ended. Inside the courtroom, the evidence laid out was damning. The prosecution presented the blood samples from the basement, the drag marks, the hair caught in tape, and the audio message from Cati's phone. The jury sat in silence as the voice memo played, the sound of Cati's final moments echoing through the courtroom. A hush fell over the room when the photo of Cati's wedding ring, buried in the dirt behind the home, was projected on screen. The jury watched as the timeline unfolded in meticulous detail, from the last known moments of Cati's life to the carefully orchestrated attempt to erase her presence. Elric's behaviour during the trial was chilling. He remained stoic, his face unreadable, even as the prosecution described how he had staged his hunting trip as an alibi. Not once did he glance at the pictures of Cati or react to her family's testimonies. When his own defense attorney argued that he had acted under emotional distress, Elric showed no emotion. The courtroom noted his silence not as grief, but as indifference. Yvenne Kress, on the other hand, presented herself as a woman manipulated by a man she loved. Her attorneys argued that she had been psychologically abused, led to believe that Cati was the enemy and that a new life with Elric was promised. But her writings told a darker story. Obsessive notes, fantasies of a life without Cati, and the burned letter with the words, "I did it for us." While she admitted to helping Elric hide the body, she denied being involved in the actual murder. Still, her involvement was undeniable. Her actions after the fact, the concealment, the lies, the silence, spoke volumes. Cati's family sat through every painful detail. Her sister, Mirella, broke down during her testimony, describing how Cati had once said she felt someone was watching her. At the time, she thought it was just stress. Now, those words haunted her. Cati's father spoke last, his voice breaking, as he described his daughter as a bright light extinguished by people who thought they deserved more than her life. His words moved the courtroom to tears. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. The verdict came swiftly. Elric Blauvelt was found guilty of first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence. Yvenne Kress was found guilty of being an accessory to murder and criminal conspiracy. Elric was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Yvenne received 25 years, with the possibility of parole after 15. Though justice had been served, the wounds left behind were deep. The Blauvelt home was sold to a distant buyer, and the guest house was torn down. No one wanted to be reminded of the horrors that had unfolded there. A memorial bench was placed at the local park, where Cati often volunteered, engraved with the words, "In loving memory of Cati Blauvelt, a voice that will never be silenced." The town of Holstead returned to its slow, quiet rhythm, but the memory of Cati's death lingered like a shadow. Her story became a cautionary tale told in hushed voices, a reminder that even in the most peaceful places, darkness can hide in plain sight. In the end, it wasn't just about a soldier's wife. It was about betrayal, obsession, and the chilling truth that some people will destroy what they can't control. And while her killers would spend decades behind bars, the loss of Cati Blauvelt would echo for generations.